boys and girls. Today I'm going to talk to you about a real person whose name was Mr. Tanen, and he was an elementary school principal in Saugus, Massachusetts, which is a little bit north of Boston. Now I bet you have someone in school who you love to see every single day, maybe a teacher or maybe a principal. And Mr. Tanen was someone just like that. This is Mr. Tanen's Ties by Mary Ann Coca Leffler. And this is dedicated to Mr. Tanen, crazy tie wearer and principal of the Lyndhurst Elementary School in Saugus, Massachusetts. Mr. Tanen is the principal of the Lyndhurst Elementary School. All the children love him, and they also love his ties. Every morning, as the children enter the school, they check out Mr. Tanen's tie. It's a good way to start the day. Mr. Tanen has quite a tie collection. Funny ties, crazy ties, holiday ties, ties that play music, and even ties that light up. He also has a big collection of tourist ties. Anytime students go on a trip, they bring home ties for Mr. Tanen. His office closet bulges with ties. He changes his ties several times a day, depending on his mood, the weather, or what's for lunch in the cafeteria. On Frankfurter Friday, he always puts on his hot dog tie. "No one will know if I get mustard on it," he says. If the weather suddenly changes, so does his tie. If he's wearing his umbrella tie, you know that it's raining even before you look outside. And for official duties, he always wears his red, white, and blue tie with yellow stars. One day, Mr. Tanen had an important meeting with Mr. Apple at the school department. Everyone in town called Mr. Apple Mr. Crabapple because he was always grouchy and never, ever smiled. Of course, Mr. Tanen wore the appropriate tie. "Mr. Tanen," Mr. Apple began, "you are a fine principal, but there is one thing that concerns me." "What's that, Mr. Apple?" asked Mr. Tanen. "Education is a serious business," said Mr. Apple. "Absolutely," agreed Mr. Tanen. "You are a role model for your students," said Mr. Apple. Mr. Tanen nodded. "Therefore, you should look proper at all times." Mr. Apple pointed to Mr. Tanen's tie. "And that is not proper." He handed Mr. Tanen a plain blue tie. "This is. From now on, Mr. Tanen, keep your silly ties in your closet. You are to wear only blue ties." Mr. Tanen was shocked. "No sports ties with soccer balls?" "No." "No tourist ties with palm trees and pink flamingos?" "No, Mr. Tanen." "No light-up tree ties at Christmas?" "No, Mr. Tanen. Blue ties, just blue." The next day, Mr. Tanen greeted the children as usual, but something was not right. "Mr. Tanen, your tie, it's just plain blue," said Alex. Mr. Tanen felt just plain blue. He sighed. "Sorry, kids. It's proper blue from now on. Strict orders from Mr. Apple." "Boring," said Carlo. "How are we going to know the weather?" asked Olivia. "Or what we're having for lunch?" said Kaylee. Mr. Tanen shrugged sadly. Mr. Tanen didn't feel like talking to anyone all morning. At lunch, he wished he had on his hot dog tie. When the second grade celebrated Kristen's birthday, he couldn't wear his special tie that played "Happy Birthday to You." Alex was worried. Mr. Tanen is not the same, he thought. Early Monday morning, the school secretary phoned Mr. Apple. Mr. Tanen just called in sick. He will be out all week with the blues. You will have to come to the Lyndhurst School to fill in as principal. The children were surprised to see Mr. Apple greet them at the door. I will be your principal for the week, he snapped. Let's have straight lines, no talking, no running. I miss Mr. Tanen already, whispered Alex. That afternoon, Mr. Apple even made recess rules. No playing on the wet grass, he yelled. You'll track mud in the school. Recess was no fun. The kids were happy when the bell rang. As they were filing in, they saw Mr. Apple climbing a tree. What's he doing up there, spying on us? Asked Kaylee. I can't believe it. He's bird watching, said Olivia. He actually looks happy, said Carlo. That gave Alex an idea. On Tuesday, Alex gave Mr. Apple a tie with birds on it. Thank you, Alex, but that's not quite my style. When he was alone, Mr. Apple stared at the tie. Cardinals are my favorite bird, he thought. He held the tie up to his plain gray suit. He couldn't help but try it on. After school, Mr. Apple wore his new tie to the grocery store. Hello, Mr. Apple, said the cashier, Miss Sweet. Good day, mumbled Mr. Apple. Lovely tie, commented Miss Sweet. You must like birds. I'm crazy about cats. Mr. Apple smiled a little. On Wednesday, Mr. Apple picked up his mail. Then he sat at Mr. Tanen's desk. But today, he couldn't concentrate. He opened Mr. Tanen's closet and searched through the ties. He found just what he was looking for. In the afternoon, he went to the grocery store again. He got in Miss Sweet's checkout line. Mr. Apple, now that's a charming tie. Mr. Apple and Miss Sweet chatted for a long time. On Thursday after school, Mr. Apple thumbed through Mr. Tanen's ties again. This time he heard music. It was coming from a tie. Mr. Apple headed to the grocery store. When he got to the register, he pressed the tie. It played, Let Me Call You Sweetheart. Mr. Apple, I never knew you could be so delightful, said Miss Sweet. Mr. Apple handed Miss Sweet a rose. Will you have dinner with me tonight? I would love to, Mr. Apple. On Friday morning, Mr. Apple greeted the children wearing a tie with red hearts. Isn't that Mr. Tanen's Valentine tie? Asked Alex. Mr. Apple grinned. Well, I don't think he'd mind if I borrowed it, do you? He won't mind, shouted all the kids. On Monday, Mr. Tanen came back to school. Mr. Apple was waiting at the door. That tie, Mr. Tanen, grumbled Mr. Apple. Oh, sorry, sir, got a stain on it. Mustard, apologized Mr. Tanen. Well, it's a good thing I bought you another one, said Mr. Apple. He handed Mr. Tanen a box. Mr. Tanen sighed. He opened the lid. A big smile spread across his face. It's just your kind of blue, said Mr. Apple. Then Mr. Apple gave him a shopping bag filled with letters. The kids have been writing me letters all week. They want their principal back, and so do I. Well, thank you, Mr. Apple. Oh, one other thing, Mr. Apple said shyly. Can you lend me this wedding bells tie? I have an important date tonight. The end. And what do you think he wore the tie to do? I think he wore the tie to ask Miss Sweet if she would become Mrs. Sweet Apple. And you're going to find out about that in the very next story, Mr. Tanen's Tie Trouble, also by Marian Coco Leffner. It was very early when Mr. Tanen unlocked the door to the school. He had a lot to do. This was the first day back after winter vacation. As principal of the Lyndhurst School, his job was to get everything ready before the children arrived. He clicked on the classroom lights. Ooh, fresh paint! Turned up the heat. Nice and warm at last. And stocked the refrigerator with milk. Brrr, the fridge is fixed. Finally, he entered his office. He opened his closet door and smiled. Ties, lots of ties, tumbled out. Mr. Tanen was known and loved for his wild and crazy tie collection. He had 975 ties. He wore a different one for every occasion, activity, or mood. He slipped on his new donut and Danish tie and poured himself a cup of coffee. Mr. Tanen arranged his ties for the day. The back to jail tie for the teacher's meeting, the school bus tie to greet the kids, and the pizza tie for lunch. Then he searched until he found the swing and slide tie. He was very excited. Today, he would announce that the school had saved enough money to install a wonderful new playground. The children deserved it. They had collected cans and held bake sales to add money to the playground fund. Ring! Just then the phone rang. It was Mr. Apple from the school department. Mr. Tanen, welcome back, said Mr. Apple. I've been working on the school budget. Everything that needed fixing was fixed over vacation. I've been noticing all morning, said Mr. Tanen. Fresh paint, steaming heat, and a cold refrigerator. Thank you so much, Mr. Apple. Well, don't thank me yet, said Mr. Apple. I've just received the bills. We are out of money. The playground will have to wait. Oh, no, Mr. Apple. Can't you find the money somewhere else, begged Mr. Tanen. What am I going to tell the kids? You'll think of something, said Mr. Apple softly. I'm sorry, Mr. Tanen. I wish I could tell you that our bank account is as full as your tie closet. Mr. Tanen sadly hung up the phone and gazed out at the broken-down playground. He heard clink, clink. He looked up to see Kaylee and Alex lugging in a big jar filled with money. Here it is, $148.29 for the playground fund, said Kaylee proudly. New playground, here we come, cheered Alex. Mr. Tanen didn't know what to say. After school, Mr. Tanen sat in his office staring at the jar. He sighed. Now I'm in a real pickle. This is not enough money for a playground. The kids will be so disappointed. Mr. Apple's words floated around in his head. The playground will have to wait. You'll think of something. I wish our bank account was as full as your tie closet. As full as my tie closet, repeated Mr. Tanen. He jumped up, opened his closet, and shouted, That's it! My ties! Lyndhurst School will have a new playground. The next day, the entire town was plastered with signs. Mr. Tanen's tie auction, Saturday at 7 p.m. at the Lyndhurst School. A tie for any occasion. All ties must go. Mrs. Sweetapple, see, we were right. He did marry her. noticed the sign on the grocery store window. She called her husband Mr. Apple. "Why is Mr. Tanen selling all his ties? Has he gone crazy?" Mr. Apple told her about the school budget and the playground money. The town was buzzing all day. Mrs. Sweet Apple called Monsieur Bijou at the bakery, who called Cleo at the cleaners, who called Dr. Demi, the dentist. It went on until even Zach, the night watchman at the zoo, got the word. Mr. Tanen is selling his ties. On Saturday, the whole town showed up for the auction. Monsieur Bijou started the bidding. "I will give you $50 for the donut and Danish tie." Lolly, the librarian, bought the book tie. Dr. Demi was the proud new owner of the toothbrush tie. Kaylee handed over her entire piggy bank for the hot dog tie. Mrs. Sweet Apple just had to have the wedding bells tie. And of course, Mr. Apple chuckled as he paid quite a bit of cash for the crabapple tie. The auction was a huge success. Every tie was sold except one. Mr. Tanen couldn't part with his beloved blue ribbon tie. It was a present from Mr. Apple for being a great principal. He looked out at a sea of townspeople wearing his ties. Thank you all. I have always taught my students, the more you give, the more you get. With this money, the Lyndhurst School will have a new playground. Mr. Tanen swallowed hard. My ties now belong to the town. Wear them proudly. And throughout the spring, that's just what everyone did. But sometimes Mr. Tanen would forget his closet was empty. He would open it to get a tie, and with a tinge of sadness, he would remember he only had one tie, and he was wearing it. Then he'd look outside at the playground being built. You have to give to get, he thought. Soon it was opening day at the new playground. Mr. Tanen had invited the whole town to the ribbon-cutting ceremony. He tucked his speech in his pocket, grabbed his special scissors, and adjusted his tie. He wished he had on his official ribbon-cutting tie. The schoolyard was overflowing with people. Mr. Tanen made his way through the crowd. Then he saw it. Mr. Tanen's playground. The playground was tied in a giant ribbon made from Mr. Tanen's ties. Mrs. Sweet Apple and Mr. Apple were at the microphone. Mr. Tanen, you have taught us all, the more you give, the more you get, said Mrs. Sweet Apple. You have given us a playground. We are giving you back your ties. With that, Mr. Apple untied the tie ribbon and announced, Mr. Tanen's playground is now open. Mr. Tanen and his ties were together again. He slipped on his swing and slide tie and smiled. And so Mr. Tanen has taught us that when you give, you might get something very wonderful, unexpected back. And I hope you learned that wonderful lesson. Thank you for listening.
Right, I'm your reader today, Diane Riley, and I'm reading Very LuLu, and it's the mostly true story of a training school dropout. Words by Stephanie Campisi and pictures by Jessica Gibson. LuLu was a free spirit. She loved to spin and roll and lean out the car window. Everywhere that LuLu went, she sniffed out fun. Sniff, sniff. She had a nose for it. Actually, she had a nose for everything. The trash can, the neighbors, the mud puddles. And that was how she ended up here. Welcome to Police Dog Academy. Well, said the officer, she's very LuLu, said LuLu's handler. The other dogs were not very LuLu at all. They could count and speak on command, woof, woof, arf, and tell left from right. And they only sniffed what they were told to sniff. LuLu sniffed anything she wanted. Like donuts, potted plants, and socks. What a mess she made. The officer took LuLu's handler aside. Do you really think LuLu has what it takes? She's very LuLu, said LuLu's handler. After lunch, the officer decided to have a talk with LuLu. LuLu, can you be more like the other dogs? You don't want to fail, do you? LuLu had not known a dog could fail anything. So she tried. She really did. The other dogs ran obstacle courses, but LuLu was an obstacle. LuLu. The other dogs fetched evidence. LuLu had to be fetched. LuLu. The other dogs tracked scents. LuLu. Really, LuLu? LuLu's eating the boxes, not tracking the scents. The officer took LuLu's handler aside. Maybe we should get some help with LuLu. She's very LuLu, said LuLu's handler. Still they tried. They really did. They brought LuLu treats. They brought LuLu toys. They even brought LuLu someone to talk to. But LuLu was still very LuLu. Mostly, LuLu was beginning to miss her old life. She missed being able to slide and scramble and tug on ropes. She missed sniffing out fun. The officer took LuLu's handler aside. Do you really think this is the job for LuLu? She's very unhappy, agreed LuLu's handler. But I know a job she's perfect for. Being part of my family. And that was how she ended up here. And there's a little note about the real LuLu. Very LuLu is based on the real story of LuLu, a black Labrador who was recruited into a CIA training program. A few weeks into training, LuLu stopped showing interest in her work. It became clear that LuLu wasn't enjoying herself, and her trainers agreed that perhaps this wasn't the job for her. When dogs leave the CIA's training programs, their handlers get the chance to adopt them. Just like the LuLu in this book, the real-life LuLu was adopted by her handler and now spends her days as a beloved family pet.
Thank you for watching Lunenburg Storytime, the books we love. If you'd like to get involved and become a reader, we'd love to have you come into our studio and read a book that you love. Our contact information is lunenburgaccess@gmail.com. So send us an email today and let us know if you'd like to become a reader. Thank you.